Hello all, my name is Govind Gopakumar and welcome to this lecture on globalization. Now at some point or the other we've all experienced this confusion about what do you mean by all this talk about global in the world. It appears to be a complex multidimensional concept, and at least in the media one encounters several terms which seem to refer to a particular kind of condition that we are facing in this world. So there's talk about globalism, globalization, globality, global age. The one that we're going to be talking quite a bit today is about globalization as a process of change. Now, what kind of a process of change is it? And one um, one scholar who introduces who's got a really interesting piece on introducing globalization speaks of it as shifting forms of human contact. Now, this shifting forms of human contact really doesn't explain much, apart from the fact that there is some form of interaction, interrelationship that is being forged through globalization. Now, in order to understand that better, I think it's important to look at different forms of globalization that are present in this world, predominantly economic, political, and sociocultural globalization. So, globalization as such has its basis in multiple parallel processes that are underway in this world. So, there are economic and political forms of globalization, social and cultural forms of globalization, which entail forms of integration and differentiation. And supporting all of this is a process of that is predominantly technological and managerial, and that process underlies and supports the existence of these other processes of change. So some features of globalization would be creation of new kinds of social interactions. And so going back to the notion that globalization could be both economic, political, and sociocultural, you can think of globalization as creating new forms of social interactions which have both economic, political, and cultural dimensions. And at the same time, it isn't just about creating new forms of interaction, it's also how existing forms of interaction are changing. And so there is a move away from a purely localized face-to-face interaction to other forms of interaction that span different parts of the planet. And so there is what scholars would call an expansion and a stretching of social activities. And at the same time, in addition to the intensification and to the expansion, there's also a process of intensification where forms of interaction and exchange are increased. The spread of these exchanges also increases, but also the intensity, the nature of the exchange, the volume of these exchanges, the quality of the exchanges, all of that has changed. And through this process of enhanced and expanded interaction and exchange, it's creating an increasing sense of consciousness of a common humanity around the world. And this is reflected in several occasions, and we'll talk about that briefly. But to give you an example, what are these new forms of interactions and connections? And so you look around the globe and you find, in addition to social media, you find new forms of international, transnational, multinational forms of exchanges at different levels in political, social, economic kinds of exchanges. And all of this is creating a sense of complexity of the kinds of interactions that are possible. But then, as I mentioned earlier, there's also an expansion and a stretching of social activities, things that didn't happen before. For example, if you had to go to see a doctor, you would choose to go to see a hospital that is as close as possible to where you're living. And now, increasingly, under the situation of medical tourism, people actually prefer to go to different countries where they can not only get their health condition treated, but they also get a cultural experience through the process of medical tourism. And so many other even Engineers Without Borders and other similar kinds of organizations are examples of this expansion and stretching of social activities. And at the same time, there's also an acceleration of social exchange in several domains, in the interrelationship between economic effects and how those economic effects spread around the world, to media and music, all the other forms of cultural interaction, and how the effects of um, one kind of culture becomes prevalent in several other places around the world. And then, as I said, all of this is forging together a sense of human interdependence and consciousness. And you see that in several situations, especially in the context of global climate change, where um, for the past 20, 30 years, there's been a growing sense that humanity is facing a major crisis, and we need to respond as a collective in order to actually try and address and get around this problem that we face on this planet. So one thing that we want to talk about in some length is that in a globalized setting, we want to talk about how is it that the economy is changing, and how can we understand economic processes of globalization. Well, predominantly, you can think of economy in a global setting as operating at several different locations. Well, the global economy, as such, with which you find mentioned in several different contexts, which seems to be an economy that operates predominantly at a global level. And so, when you take examples of firms like FedEx and other kinds of logistics and supply chain firms that actually operate on the basis of an interconnected world where commerce needs to happen across national boundaries. And at the other spectrum is the local economy, which in many ways is the economy that is incredibly localized, where goods and services are exchanged within a small localized setting. A good example of that are things like farmers' markets, where by necessity many of these products have to be bought and sold in very close quarters. And then between these two extremes is what we could call a hybrid or a global and a local together, and some form of a global economy that is that happens, which exists through the connection between the global economy operating within a local setting, or the local setting becoming exceptionally important for global interactions. And so there are two different forms that I feel exist within this context of the global or the hybrid economy, which is through localized globalism, where the notion that global connections happen, and they happen only because of particular locations. And if you don't take into account those locations and the kinds of incentives and the opportunities that are provided by those local settings, then you cannot think of the global economy actually. So, for example, hyper global financial centers like London and New York exist because they're closely tied to the opportunities provided by these mega cities, both in terms of capital, both in terms of human resources, educational resources, political resources that are in some sense tied to that local context. You couldn't think of a global financial center in any other location. Say, for example, in a village in the middle of Canada, we couldn't think of a global financial center operating successfully. And at the same time, you have instances of globalized localism, where increasingly ideas that you need to reroute the economy and relocate the economy within a local context, and those ideas are spreading around the world through ideas that you need to purchase from independent producers and only think of local to local supply chains. Many of these ideas, the way they've been branded, the way they're in some sense spreading and franchised around the world, is creating this alternate kind of movement of globalized localism. It's much smaller, but certainly cannot be ignored in the global context. And so, in this context, what is happening to economic development? And so, economic development has been going through different phases of what I would call the flat world economy. And so, the flat world economy 1, the flat world economy 1.5, and so on and so forth. Well, the flat world economy 1 was what you found at the turn of this century. So, around 2000s, there was a widespread search for cost efficiency platforms in terms of offshoring of manufacturing as well as outsourcing of business services and processes around the world. And through this process of moving to different locations, multinational corporations were trying to create um, um, ventures and processes that were cost efficient, that were reducing their financial bottom line. And what has been the response to this, and what I call the flat world economy 1.5, has been the problem of deindustrialization and local economic collapse. And so, what one finds in many industrialized countries as a result of that, of what scholars have called a conscious process of deindustrialization, where heavy manufacturing, as well as many of the service industry associated with large multinational corporations, have decided to move shop to other locations around the world where they feel they will be able to use local talent at a much cheaper rate. And that has resulted in deindustrialization in several industrialized and developed countries around the world, predominantly in countries like in Canada, in certainly in the United States, and in some Western European countries. And so this has created a movement to try and refocus the flat world economy in these industrialized contexts around questions of how is it we can support local initiatives and local businesses and local enterprises. And now increasingly one hears of the flat world economy version 2, or of widespread economic globality, where it isn't just about cost efficiency platforms, it's actually going a few steps further than that, where we're talking about not just about innovation, but distributed innovation, innovation that happens around the world. And then we're talking about multiple competitors in different locations who are also actually becoming major players in the process of economic globality. And so we're not just talking about major multinational corporations located in industrialized countries, but we're also talking about major actors, corporate and economic actors arising around the world and competing with each other, not just for markets and consumers in predominantly industrialized contexts, but also around the world. And so this is a much more complex kind of economic situation where we are entering. And so the response has been this kind of economic globality, of economic growth happening, of kind of capitalist globalization in some sense happening around the world, can have serious consequences on the ecological stability of our planet. And so we need to be actually thinking at a planetary level about how is it that we can redirect our economic ventures so that they fall within kind of human and ecological needs of the planet. And this is the current thinking around, how do we revision this? More about this. We'll talk more about this when in the lecture on sustainability, but I just thought I'd let you know. Now, the other key point that I want to make in this lecture is about the relation between globalization and technology. And I think that is a crucial point, and it interests many of us, given that we have an engineering background. We want to think of how is it that we can think of technology within this kind of global setting. Clearly, globalization and technology has been a very close relationship. And technology has played a critical role in several sectors of globalization, in business and finance, manufacturing and industry, media, entertainment, as well as environment and energy production. So clearly, it seems to be a very critical dimension, but it's important to also realize that technology is in some sense not the driver behind globalization, and it's not globalization that's resulting as a result of technological changes. Why do I say that? And I'll talk about this in a few minutes, but the point I'm trying to make is that it's based on the kinds of choices that different countries, different corporations, different societies are making about the nature of the technological advances that they're interested in, and that is shaping the kinds of global interactions that we are having. One one key aspect through which technology, in some sense, is supporting the process of globalization has been what have been called flat world technologies, technologies that support and undergird the nature of interactions, of economic, social, informational, managerial interactions that are happening around the world. And that happens first through a hardware backbone of transportation links and kind of undersea fiber optic networks that you now find around the world for the first time, as well as you find kind of middleware of kind of distributed applications, as well as organizational software of all kinds of organizational innovations that are necessary for actually ensuring that products move from one part of the planet to another part of the planet, and raw materials also. And so it's not just goods and services that are moving, but also raw materials and energy and resources that are resources that are actually moving around the planet. So when we think of technology and globalization, I think it's important to bear in mind what is the role that technology plays in this context. Well, within an economic setting, in an economic understanding, technology plays a major role in enhancing productivity. And so whether that is local productivity or global productivity, technology plays a major role. And it's through that role of productivity increase that technology plays a role in spurring economic growth. And through spurring economic growth, it allows for income growth. And that's the conventional kind of economic orthodoxy that if you if you result in technological progress, it almost automatically results in income growth and economic development. And so by enhancing productivity, you can create economic growth and income growth in societies. And so that is why many countries around the world are talking about, especially the World Bank in their global economic prospects, talks about the role of technological progress. And this is best understood in what the World Bank calls technological achievement index. And through this technology achievement index, you can see that there are leaders, and then there are some countries that are considered leaders where a lot of the innovation happens, where a lot of the technological absorption happens in societies. And then there are other countries which are potential leaders, which are not quite as fast in the process of achieving innovation and incorporating technology, but are certainly very quick about adopting technologies. And then there are those who are dynamic adopters, and some who are quite a few who are marginalized in this context. And so what that tells you is that technology and technological achievement is great, but it's increasingly happening in an unequal world. And so when you think of other factors and not just technology as a role in economic productivity, but technology also plays a role in several other social and political factors. And how do you incorporate technology, and how do you think about how is it that technology can be incorporated in societies in order to actually bring about more political freedom in the world, or reduce income inequality, or bring about enhanced social development, enhance education, enhance health, all of these kinds of social and political factors. What is the role that technology plays in addressing these? Because it isn't just economic production and economic productivity that we're interested in. We're interested in creating a much more of an equal world, and technology clearly plays a role. And technology plays a role primarily because different countries are adopting and utilizing and incorporating technologies in very different ways. It doesn't happen automatically, and it doesn't happen automatically because countries are on different pathways of progress and development. They have different systems of governance. They also have different structures associated with their society and their economy. And all of this is creating a really complex environment where technology change is happening without actually thinking about what kind of a society we need to create. And so this is resulting in a much more of an unequal world where there is technology that is there's a lot of technology change happening, but it's happening unequally. And so some technologies spread very rapidly, for example, mobile phones. And so if you take mobile phone penetration around the world, it's becoming very, very equal around the world. Global rates of penetration of mobile phones are becoming very similar. But at the same time, if you look at some of the other older technologies, the spread of those technologies is still very unequal, and it's creating persistent gaps in how those technologies are being incorporated. And so, although there have been recent improvements, much of those improvements are happening in some technologies, like, for example, mobile phones, internet. But in many of the other technologies, especially the older technologies, the spread is much slower. And so, in thinking about this, I think it's important to think about two concepts: technology diffusion and technology absorption. And then, more important, what is the nature of the absorptive capacity of technology in different contexts? So, what are the different factors that influence the absorptive capacity of technologies in different countries? So, governance, the nature of the political will in different countries, the business environment in these countries, the nature of the policy environment, and the availability of human capital and human resources that are literate enough to actually adopt these technologies. And so all of these factors play a big role in the kind of absorptive capacity. But I think it's important. All of these factors are important, but I think it's important to bear in mind that governance and the role of political will plays a major role in the kinds of social change that can be brought about through technology. And so in order to think about how is it that we can promote more equal technological change, that's where the question of social innovation comes in. And we'll talk about this in a later lecture. We talk about alternate pathways to innovation and why is it that these are important. We also want to talk about mainstreaming inclusive innovation efforts in ways that bring technology to excluded populations, not just income excluded, but also in many other socially excluded populations around the world. And in doing that, government support, political will, political interest, political mobilization, all of that plays a major role. Same time, in the importance of a supportive business environment, a business environment that is not just supportive, but also open to multiple forms of ventures that have less of a financial bottom line interest, but much more of a social economic interest. Thank you.